I just want to join others in thanking Francis, Sarah, and Betsy for their meticulous and innovative way in organizing this conference. It's been a very special and enjoyable learning experience for me, and I'm particularly appreciative that art historians have been included into the fold of Buddhist studies. This interdisciplinarity has, well, first of all, my title is New Approaches to the Buddhist Art Survey. When I actually submitted it, I didn't add the subtitle or 3 desperate attempts at relevance. Mainly because I didn't know if Canadians understood irony. But
oh, do we ever?
That's good because there'll be a lot of irony today. This interdisciplinarity has certainly made me more sensitive to the ambiguous role that images play in Buddhist studies. On the one hand, visual and material manifestations of Buddhism have become key players in what might be termed the sensual turn in religious studies, promoted by scholars of American religion, such as Sally Promey and David Morgan, who in turn align with earlier arguments by Buddhologists such as Gregory Chopin. Chopin, of course, has famously called out the Protestant presuppositions in Buddhist studies that prioritize text over stuff, and the mistaken belief that reading and writing by elites supersede in cultural and social importance the looking, touching, smelling, hearing, and tasting as the core common practices of Buddhism. In fact, I know that Buzzy Tizer at Princeton and Bob Sharf at Berkeley, this is where I name drop, not only publish on images themselves, and Amanda can talk to this more specifically, but actively encourage their students to learn art history as manifested in the work of their respective students. And not to mention the scholars here in this room, such as Sujong and Natasha, who also actively engage in images in their own research. So the visual and material turn in Buddhist studies, whether it's framed by an interest in the sensory experience of religion or driven by a commitment to the things that bind common spiritual needs, art history clearly opens up promising new paths in Buddhist studies. But in the few times that I've gone to YABS or AAR, I have been struck by the overwhelming majority of panels and talks that focus on the finer points of philology or philosophy. So the visual and material turn in Buddhist studies is clearly in motion, but its turning continues to be slow and incremental. And I would be interested to hear your thoughts on why this might be so, and especially from the students, who I think we have not heard that much from, but who in many ways should be the primary voice in our discussions here at this conference. So in this spirit, I would like to move from this general overview of research trends to the focus of this conference, which is pedagogy, and more specifically, the questions of what do we do with the introductory survey, which might be considered the vanilla ice cream in our pedagogical repertoire. It's easy, requires no preparation, and is oddly comforting. Indeed, there are images from my introductory survey of Buddhist art that have visible dust scanned into them, a testament to the moment 15 years ago when I transferred all of my carousel slides to PowerPoints. But seeing the same dust every year on the same slides also became overwhelmingly metaphorical. Should I literally dust things off, move things around, add new things, or should I just leave things the way they are? I mean, would the students even care or notice? I don't know. In short, why mess with vanilla ice cream? It is what it is. Well, call me queer, but I think it's very important to mess with vanilla ice cream. So regardless of our specific disciplines, I would like to suggest the possibility that just as we are what we eat, we are what we teach. And in this sense, the introductory survey is too basic to ignore inasmuch as it bears the full weight of the canon and shines a bright light on our role in questioning or perpetuating systems of power. And in this day and age, we don't need, as Natasha, as Natasha so powerfully began in your keynote to wait for a colleague to accidentally discover our parochialism, our syllabi are plastered all over the internet already. And so a couple of years ago, I decided to cut back on my horror movie consumption and spend some time revamping my introductory survey of Buddhist art from a syllabus that was basically 20% India, 40% China, 40% Japan, and 100% pre-modern, to a syllabus that was recalibrated to cover in equal proportions 5 areas: 1, South Asia; 2, Southeast Asia; 3, East Asia; 4, the Himalayas; and 5, what is known as the global contemporary, which refers to both a time and a place. Chronologically, it covers a period after 1989, with the end of the Cold War, and you might say the rise of China. And geographically, it is limited only by air travel and the internet. The global contemporary is also significant for Asian art, since it is a period in which many of these artists began to draw inspiration from their own Buddhist practices and traditions, as well as integrate these Buddhist practices and traditions into the international vocabulary of contemporary art, and join the dynamic flow of biennials, triennials, and art fairs that dot the globe and seem to have a particular appeal to millennials and their addiction to art selfies. So for the purposes of this presentation, I would like to focus on the role of the global contemporary in the refurbishment of my own introductory survey. While the global contemporary only covers the last 30 years of a Buddhist art tradition that is over 2,000 years long, as far as the vast majority of my student evaluations are concerned, it is the 30 years that really matter. In other words, it is the 30 years that are relevant to them and their experiences, which brings me to the subtitle of my presentation, that is the 3 lenses or desperate attempts at relevance that I've used to create a more connective environment for my students as they try to understand an unfamiliar religion and artistic tradition. So that's my reading part. You'll notice that art historians tend to be kind of formal. I could not imagine wearing sweatpants. But in the spirit of this workshop, I'm actually going to stop reading, and we're just going to look at slides, and we'll work off of them. Okay, so I'm going to focus. Okay, so there are a wide range of artists that you could use who deal with Buddhism in their work. I'm going to focus on Quan. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this artist. He is perhaps one of the top 3 most famous contemporary Chinese artists working today. He's on that level of an Ai Weiwei. But Ai Weiwei gets all the attention because of his, I'd say, savvy media use of human rights activism. And he was born in 1965. So he lived through the Cultural Revolution as a child. This has a huge impact on how contemporary Chinese artists deal with their interactions with the world. If they're older, many of their artworks tend to address the Cultural Revolution, but this particular generation is a little bit beyond that because they're too young to actually have been too traumatized by that period, which lasted from 1966 to 1976. And I'm going to be focusing on one particular work of his called Pagoda from 2009. And I'm going to begin with my attempt at relevance number 1, which is to contemporize. And I want to make a distinction between the contemporary as a time period and contemporize as an actively dynamic process where you integrate the past and the present together so that the historical references are always present in an attempt to connect with the current time. So in my slides, I've tried to separate out 2 themes in this contemporary art that might relate to more traditional Buddhist ideas, and then 2 down here which are more relevant for contemporary issues. And I'll read them out because I think maybe they're a little bit too small for people to look like. So to contemporize, I have more traditional ideas of art for merit and commemoration. And it's a respect for all forms of life. I'll explain more in detail. And in a contemporary way, this work also responds to, you might say, a hyper-focus that we have on environmental disaster and climate change and on human rights. So what is going on here is you have a very large installation, right? It's a type of contemporary art language made out of bricks that Zhang Quan has collected from the urban renewal that's happening in his hometown of Shanghai. He has a vast studio there, and it's very large. You can say like a human being would stand about this high, but it's separated out, so you can take it apart and reconstruct it as it's exhibited all over the world. And when you think about pagoda, and this is very, again, a way to deal with the contemporary, is that it's not very linear or specific where the historical references come from. You can just go on the internet, find something you like, and then use that as your historical reference. And I was thinking, like, where does this come from? Because this does not look like any kind of pagoda in China, which is my field of research. But it does look like this pagoda here, which is actually where I was born in Burma or Myanmar. And it's called the Babaji Pagoda. It's from the 7th century, and it's almost an exact duplicate. So he's very free with his references, and that is, I think, one aspect of contemporizing. It also is an act of commemoration and merit, because he made that work after the horrible earthquake that happened on May 12th in 2008 in Sichuan. Do you remember this event? Basically, it was a 7.9 magnitude earthquake. It hit a very mountainous region of Sichuan province here in southwest China. And it had an epicenter in Wenchuan County. The human toll, and this is an official information source from the People's Republic of China, stands at 87,150 dead, 17,923 missing, and most tragically, an estimated 5,000 students who were in these schools losing their lives because they were so poorly constructed. You can see here, this was called tofu drag construction because they weren't really using strong concrete or steel rebar to actually support it. So when you talk about 5,000 students dying, you're also talking about 5,000 only children dying. And the parents, as you can see here, were just, traumatized. But frustrating enough for them, the state had forbidden any kind of public display of mourning. And so that's another topic for another presentation about how they have ritualized this date, May 12th, in a way that is non-threatening, yet still is able to, for them to deal with this loss and trauma. So his way of commemorating this is that when you take a closer look at his art, that piece, Pagoda, you'll notice here, I don't know if you can see, but it's a pig. It's a taxidermy pig. The role of taxidermied animals in contemporary art is also another very interesting and rich topic, but we won't get into that today. But just to, you might want to talk about this with your students, for example, about how animals have a very different view, not only in Buddhism, but also in the East and in China. Because do you know this character? Anybody? So Xia is like the character for home, but it's a kind of combination between a radical for a house or roof and the character for pig. So basically, home, family is a pig under a roof, and that's what we kind of have here. And it's not. In other words, we're already rethinking the value of life, that pigs are not some kind of lowly being or a derogatory term that sometimes is used in the West, but as actually something that's quite valued and is at the very center of home and family. This is not about pagoda, but I just wanted to kind of give you a better sense of Zhang Quan's artistic career. He started out and he became famous as a performance artist, and this is one of his most famous works from 1994. Back then he was not the global superstar that he is today, and so many artists, when they are young and poor and fit. You might say turn to performance art where they take off all their clothes and do like weird things. So, and in fact, I did interview him, and I said, "Why don't you do performance art anymore?" And he said, "Because I don't look good anymore." So, this is his most famous work. It's from that period, that early period, and here he. Okay, I don't know if any of you have visited China or have gone to any of the public toilets there. Sure. So it's you basically don't breathe for 10 minutes, right, as you enter. He went there into the most foul public toilet in the neighborhood that he lived in, which was a slum in East Beijing at the time. And he covered himself with a mixture of honey and fish oil. This is where you see this glistening aspect on his skin. And he sat there for an hour. And he didn't move. So you could say that it was a kind of a combination between endurance art, it's a type of performance art, and Buddhist meditation. And a kind of, and he wrote about it. So he was very conscious of what was happening to him at the time. He was conscious of the flies that started to stick to his body. He was conscious of the flies that started to crawl into his nose. And that became, part of the entire experience. It was also photographed, and later on you might wonder, like, how did these artists make money? So these photographs now sell for like $100,000 from this performance, right? But who would have known back in 1994? One of the things that I find very interesting about this, and is kind of overlooked in discussions of contemporary Chinese art, is the spiritual references or the references to traditional Buddhist iconography. And even though people focus on this use of honey and oil as a way to show how much you had to go through in this experience, visually speaking, it actually looks very much like the bronze sculptures of Buddhas that we oftentimes see in museums. So he was really turning himself not only into a performance artist, but also into a Buddhist sculpture, a traditional Buddhist sculpture. And this one is actually from the ROM, which you can see here if you look down the block. It's a Miroku, or a Buddha of the future. This is from Japan, from the 13th century. Attempt at relevance number 2, globalize. And here we can think about these two Buddhist ideas here of dependent origination and of impermanence, and then the sort of contemporary frame that would relate to that or align with that would be internet and social media. Zhugang is this pig that I'll get into in a second, and then migration and identity. So before Pagoda took shape, that artwork that I was just talking about, the pig, the taxidermied pig, was an actual pig. This was a Chinese, you could say, internet superstar. During this earthquake, there was a pig that survived for 49 days on the rubble beneath. For 49 days in the rubble of all the schools and other destruction, which kind of tells you a lot about the strength of these animals. And he was nicknamed Zhugang, or Pig Steel Strength. And he kind of became a symbol of hope and of survival during this time period. Zhang Huan, the artist, also became very obsessed with his pig because of the 49 days, which to him also paralleled the 49 days of purgatory in traditional Chinese Buddhism. So it related to his personal beliefs, as well as, he saw an opportunity for publicizing his work. And so he adopted the pig, and he decided to have a show of the pig in London. So this is in London at White Cube. It's one of their top galleries there. And ideally what he wanted to do was to ship the pig, this is Zhugang here in another form of representation, to London, where he would mate with an English pig, a sow, and they would have this wonderful family, and it would just be bliss for the pigs. But because of migration issues, the British authorities did not allow a live pig to come into the UK. So what he did was have a live feed, a video feed of the pig from Shanghai projected onto the wall of the gallery while the actual English sow roamed about. And then you might wonder, well, how did they interact? And this is where my students love this, is that Zhang Huan, the artist, created an internet dialogue through WeChat, which is the main messaging platform in China. And him just giving you a clip, okay? So Flower is the sow. And so this was like actually projected onto the gallery wall, okay? And this is so much more interesting than reading Buddhist sutras, I think. So Flower, I already have a child. Do you mind? When I was in high school, I didn't know any better. I fell for this hot guy. He was the captain of the football team. I ended up having his kid. Later, he went to play for Madrid Real. And now he's a huge star. He left me and his kid behind. You are a real man. You have a sense of family. So going back to the character for Jia, which is basically pig under a roof. Gang Chang, of course I mind. I didn't plant those seeds. Send me a photo of your kid. I'll take a look. Well, the child does look really obedient, which is, of course, the only thing parents care about in China. Flower said, well, he looks a little like you. You have to watch out for these, manipulative statements sometimes. Gang Chang, if people didn't know, they might think he was my own child. Not bad. So they ended up, together. This is just another kind of flashback to one of Zhang Huan's earlier performance works that also give you some kind of context to these themes that I've been talking about. This is something that he did in New York. Again, this is migration as well, not of the pig, but of himself, because he spent 10 years in New York. And that's where he attended a Zen center, and his own Buddhist practice became a little bit more formalized. He grew up in China as a folk Buddhist, not to demean that practice by using the term folk, but it was a kind of domestic practice. It wasn't formalized. When he went to New York, he actually joined a Zen temple there. And this was one of his famous performances in New York called Pilgrimage, Wind and Water in New York. And here is a Ming-style bed. It's not antique. You can get this for $500 online. And he had a lot of ice cubes put onto it. And he entered into this courtyard. It was at PS1 in New York. So I don't know if you've been there. It's the kind of contemporary arm of MoMA. And he entered into the courtyard to the sound of Tibetan chants, which shows you the degree of exoticization that the Chinese themselves have for Tibet. And he's very much part of that, because there was this bizarre, random Tibetan chants going on. He walked into it, and then he lay down on this bed of ice, naked, of course, as a type of endurance art. But all around him, in addition to the Tibetan chants, he had these dogs that were barking madly. And then somebody said, why do you have this? And he said, because, I've been in New York, and it is this large city with so many people, but I've never felt so lonely and alienated in my life. And those of us who have lived in New York know this. It's one of the paradoxes of New York. And, but he said, I don't understand, though, that, nobody says hello to me, but they have these amazingly well-groomed dogs. And they seem to treat dogs better than they do human beings. And so he actually collected all of these incredibly well-groomed, purebred dogs, gathered them around his bed, and they were barking with the Tibetan chants. So, I mean, again, you can talk about migration, you can talk about alienation, as well as, this kind of meditative practice, you might say, that he's doing on top of the ice. So attempt at relevance number 3. I don't know how I'm doing for time.
You have 6 minutes.
Okay. So attempt at relevance number 3 is to localize. And here we can think about samsara, death and rebirth, as like classic Buddhist themes, and how they might relate to things such as urban redevelopment and exhibition and display as a way to encourage students to have critical thinking skills. This pagoda, that, to return back to the artwork at hand, was displayed internationally at 2 or 3 venues, actually just 2 venues, and then it kind of disappeared into a private collection. But I was able to go to the one when it was in Los Angeles. This is at a private gallery called, or commercial gallery called Blum and Poe. And he integrated pagoda into a larger exhibition that he called 49 Days. And they had these bricks of pigs and skulls. Altogether, there were 10 of them. And then he had this pagoda in a separate room as a kind of 11th figure. And in many ways, this refers to something very historical. For those of you who are familiar with Chinese ideas of rebirth, or with the work of Stephen Tizer or Buzzy Tizer, you know that it deals with the dead going through these courts in purgatory, and that there were 7 courts for 7 days, one court every 7 days for 7 weeks. So you have 49 days. And then another court at the 100th day, and another court at the 1st year anniversary of death, and then a last court at the 3rd year anniversary. So altogether, there would be 10 courts. And of course, the argument that Tizer makes is that there was the original Indian view of purgatory, which only lasted 49 days, but then you had to add the extra 3 courts to extend it to 3 years to meet Chinese funerary practices, which lasted 3 years of mourning. So it's a kind of attitude of signification. But so I would argue within this that you have the 10 pigs and skulls that would be the 10 courts. And then the pagoda would be what you have here, also in medieval Chinese belief of the Bodhisattva Dizang or Chitigarbha, who is a savior of last resort. So even if you are, just judged horribly at all the 10 courts, Chitigarbha can come at the end and save you. So this is how the exhibition context can give you some type of a gloss to the art object. And so now, in the spirit of localizing, I'm going to move to the ROM. I went there 2 days ago when I first got here, and I spent like 2 hours, and I said, well, hopefully there'll be something here that I can use for my presentation, because I always like to incorporate local things. And if there isn't, then I'm not going to use it, because I don't want to force something that doesn't exist just because it's convenient. But there was something there. So I was very excited, sort of. But so localize. Use the Buddhist art at the ROM to encourage critical thinking in students. So when you enter into the ROM, am I saying correctly? Is it ROM? Okay. When you enter into the ROM, you go through past the dinosaurs, like the literal ones, and then you see the Buddhist galleries here. So some of you will recognize this, right? And then, museum exhibitions always have a crowd management scheme. So there is always a way, you may not realize it yourself, but you're moving in a way that they want you to move as you move to the galleries. And so you see this here. What are you going to do? Are you going to go straight back here? No. You're going to turn to your right. And what do you see there first? You see rubbings. Okay, these are rubbings. Do you know about this Chinese technique? You basically take paper and tap it against stone carvings, and then you get an imprint of calligraphy or images or whatever. So these are very famous steles with rubbings. This one probably the most famous one. It's called, colloquially, the Nestorian stele. It's the Da Qin Jing Jiao Liu Xing Zheng Guo Bei. So this refers to Rome and Nestorianism coming to China stele. And you have this here. And then you have this one here, which commemorates a mosque and how the first Ming emperor allowed Muslims to thrive in China. And then here, this stele right here is very interesting, which talks about a synagogue in China, which was also allowed to thrive. And interestingly enough, the term for synagogue, at least in this stele, is called qingzhensi, or the same term that you would find as mosque. So they were both referred to as the same. And I was wondering, like, why? Like, why are these things here? And these are the first things that you see into a gallery that is actually most famous. This is actually a destination for this. This is a very famous Bishop White murals that were taken from a temple in China dated to 1298, but this all happened in the early 20th century. And I would say that, because I'm a museum snob, that most museums are not worth going to, but there are some that have destination pieces. And this is a destination piece. Like, I would come to Toronto just to go see this. And I have. That's why I came. Not for this, but I'm just joking. So you have this mural, and it's enormous. You know, a person would stand like that high. And it is a paradise of Maitreya. So Maitreya, again, is the Bodhisattva, or the Buddha of the future, who is currently a Bodhisattva, but will become reborn as the next Buddha. And it has an entire gathering of bodhisattvas and other deities. So that would have been part of a temple wall. I'm almost done. And here's a kind of overview of that section, right? Here's the Paradise of Maitreya. There are other two murals on either side that show Taoist and Buddhist figures together in a procession. And I was really interested in this because the central area right here kind of mimics an altar because it's a raised square platform. But the arrangement of all of these sculptures in this way that radiates outward is very unconventional. You would never have that. And then you have this structural pillar from the museum here. And it almost seems as if the whole point of this altar was to create like a distraction for this huge that's in the center of this room. And then you have all these other kind of random Buddhist sculptures that face inwards to create a kind of enclosed space. And you know, you can sit here, and there are other people here that are, you know, just enjoying this. But it's interesting because when I was talking about those three stele rubbings, they're right here. So when you enter into the space, that's what you see first, is these three steles that, in fact, typically, if you saw these stele rubbings in another museum maybe, they would be worked into a narrative of the Silk Road, where Islam, Judaism, Christianity came to China from the West via the Silk Road. But here, there's another narrative going on. It's not about the Silk Road. It's really more about the presence of Christian missionaries in China who were able to take this artwork out of China at the time and bring it to the ROM. So it's a very interesting subtext, or you might say narrative that rather than challenging repatriation or issues of spolia, it actually supports it. I think the ROM is a highly conservative institution. I'm almost done. Because now it's, yeah. So use of text in museums, I mean, you can read this on your own because you live here. But they also have a video. The video is so slow paced that I actually don't have to show it in motion. I can actually take pictures of it and you get the same idea. So it's a kind of representation of history. And it says, during the 1920s, China was in a chaotic state. Armies plundered through villages. The monks in this monastery, in order to protect the murals, decided to gather people and to cut the wall painting into sections and store it away. But there was drought and famine followed, and the monks were destitute. So they approached some art dealers Bishop White was serving as an Anglican bishop of Henan province, where this temple was, or actually it's the province south of that temple. Bishop White was serving as an Anglican bishop of Henan province. It's the same text, but they changed the image, and he looks incredibly scholarly. I mean, if somebody were going to steal somebody's paintings, he would be a good candidate. And he heard about the role or the sale of these paintings, and he had connections with various dealers. Here are his notes about how much he paid, only like $5,000. The paintings were hidden in Taiyuan. That's a little bit north of where the actual temple was. And from there, someone obviously procured the services of American Express. And then from Boston, it came to Toronto by train. The paintings have never moved since 1933. So they're meant to be there. And I think that's one of the reasons why, going back to this setup, this has not moved since 1933, according to the authorities of the museum. So of course you'd have this pillar there. And of course you would have to, I mean, there's a sense that it's found a new home. And it's meant to be here, which is, I think, a great way to start a discussion with your students about whether or not they should be here, whether or not they should be returned. How is the museum framing the narrative of the journey of these art objects? You know, it's really up to you to discuss that. Okay, so I'm going to end here, and thank you very much. Too much time.